It looks like I've stumbled upon a video featuring Casey Luskin titled "A Mathematical Problem Evolution Can't Escape." I have a feeling this will have almost nothing to do with mathematics, but let's dive in anyway.
What we see in the fossil record is a repeated pattern of explosions, where new types of organisms appear abruptly in the fossil record without clear direct evolutionary precursors.
The usage of the word explosion in reference to the periods of time mentioned indicates the relative speed as compared to geologic time. I've never seen one of these fossil explosion periods which wasn't an estimated tens of millions of years long, which is more than enough time for any known organism to have millions of generations born and died. I don't know what Luskin means by, quote, clear direct evolutionary precursors here. Well, maybe he'll specify. Let's see.
And so, for example, the most famous one of these is the Cambrian explosion, where most of the major groups of animals called phyla appear in the fossil record in the Cambrian about 520, 530 million years ago in a very abrupt manner. And this, I think Richard Dawkins said, this is more or less an exact quote, that it's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. I mean, that's really extraordinary.
A random quote from Richard Dawkins means nothing. I'll be interjecting a lot in this video because I understand this particular individual tends to make a lot of claims really quickly. Carrying on.
And we see other explosions in the history of life. We see that there is a plant explosion. There's an angiosperm explosion where you see what's called the big bloom of flowering plants. There's an explosion of different types of fish. There's a bird explosion in the fossil record. There's a mammal explosion in the fossil record. The origin of our own genus Homo, we're the species Homo sapiens, it has been called a Big Bang theory of human evolution because the human-like body plan appears abruptly in the fossil record.
I really wish creationists would stop abusing the term Big Bang so much. The visual element of the term is entirely inapplicable to the evolutionary radiation events he's referring to. Also, it is well known that fossilization is a relatively rare process in the natural world, so it's hardly surprising to find some gaps between changes to a creature's body plan in the fossil record. In fact, there's plenty of gaps in the fossil record that have nothing to do with these explosions whatsoever.
So this is a pattern that we see over and over again. And in my view, as an ID theorist, I think what we're seeing is the infusion of very large amounts of information into the biosphere to generate new types of organisms, and that is reflected in the abrupt appearance of these new types of organisms. So again...
Oh, that's where he was going. Well, until I see a method for testing whether or not any given organism has had its information increased, whatever that's supposed to mean, I'll be sticking with the explanations provided by evolutionary biology. Thanks.
Again, ideas about the origin of new types of information and where does information come from. What we see in the fossil record is the same pattern. Very large amounts of information being introduced into the natural world very rapidly, and that shows up as these explosions of new types of life forms in the fossil.
Can I get a definition of information here? As far as I know, information is not a term that has specific meaning in biology, so I can't even evaluate what's being claimed here.
Fossil record. It's a positive argument for intelligent design. We go on, but yeah, I think these are some of the main lines of evidence that I would hit.
How does the physical change of a population of organisms indicate a supernatural intelligence? I can only assume there'll be some explanation of how the designer in intelligent design performs this act, but then again, it wouldn't be the first time I've been disappointed by a video like this.
And what would be the counter explanation for the way that the fossil record looks that would say the cause for that is not what you're saying, but it's Darwin's idea? Or I mean, what would be the counter to that?
Yeah, well, the main one that you hear is what is called punctuated equilibrium, okay? And that is a model that was developed by Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge in the 1970s. Basically, the history of paleontology post-Darwin went something like this, okay? When Darwin wrote Origin of Species, he actually acknowledged that if his theory was true, you should find all these intermediate forms in the fossil record, and he also acknowledged that we didn't see them, okay? But he believed that the fossil record was incomplete, and that over time, as paleontologists searched more and more, they would find these intermediate forms. So it took over 100 years, but in the 70s or 80s, the field of paleontology sort of had a reckoning. And this was really led by Gould and Eldridge. And they said, look, these predicted transitional forms in the fossil record, by and large, have not been found. Yeah, there are occasional fossils that might be potential transitional forms. We could talk about those. In fact,
just to make a smaller point clear, every fossil is a transitional fossil. Life doesn't stop evolving even when it finds success in a stable niche of the environment. Research on molecular evolution has shown that constant mutations that provide neither a significant hindrance nor advantage continually happen over time. So if we were able to get and test the genetic material of fossils we'd consider to be of the same species from thousands of years apart, the genetic material would show differences even if the overall form, composition, and structural parts of the creature were the same.
a lot of them have issues where they really can't be transitional forms when you drill down into what they actually are. But Eldridge and
Well, it seems Mr. Luskin either doesn't know what a transitional fossil is, or is using an utterly dishonest definition of the term. As I mentioned, all fossils are transitionary forms, that is, a life form that has the characteristics of multiple separate lineages that are present after it. Some of these fossils have a mixture of characteristics which people find comparatively striking, because they are fossils of species which were close to the most recent common ancestor of multiple major taxa of life. Beyond how these fossils look to us as people, there's no real evolutionary difference between them and any other fossils that have been found.
Gould came up with this model of punctuated equilibrium, where basically they said that evolution takes place so rapidly in small populations and in short periods of time that there are not sufficient opportunities for the transitional morphology to have the opportunity to be fossilized, okay? So basically evolution happens so rapidly and in such small populations, you don't have opportunities to fossilize the intermediate stages in evolution, okay? So I've never found this theory very convincing, because it's basically a theory that predicts that you should find no confirming fossil evidence, okay?
No, even going by the definition he just gave, that's not what punctuated equilibrium predicts. Firstly, and a common error creationists make, punctuated equilibrium is not proposed to apply to all scenarios of rapid evolutionary change. It is thought to apply to a majority of these situations, but not every last one of them. Secondly, populations not in evolutionary stasis are not claimed to have any particular size by the theory. Something that is approximately true about punctuated equilibrium that Mr. Luskin indicated is that cladogenesis, the process of a new species developing from the population of an existing creature, usually involves a relatively small group of individuals from the initial population, but this also isn't an absolute. Finally, since changes in the characteristics of a creature during cladogenesis build up piecemeal, just like any other evolutionary changes, fossils of creatures during the starting and ending periods of the speciation event will very closely match the populations from before and after the event, respectively. Without detailed knowledge of the characteristics of these before and after populations, a transitional form like this could be very easily confused as nothing other than a member of one of those populations. So, overall, no. Punctuated equilibrium does not claim there shouldn't be any fossils of transitional forms. It says that fossils from the period of change should be rare and often hard to tell apart from the species they bridge between.
So I give this analogy. Let's say, remember when we used to watch VHS tapes, okay? Let's say I've got a VHS tape. And I give you this tape and I say, I promise you, Brandon and Alan, that I caught leprechauns on this VHS tape. Now, they're too small and too fast to be seen, but I promise you they're there. Are you going to believe me? You're going to be like,
Yeah.
no, I think you're trying to sell me something that isn't good here. Okay. That's
Right.
kind of the way I feel about punctual equilibrium. The evolution is always taking place somewhere else or in a place where it couldn't be recorded by the fossil record. I don't find that to be a very compelling theory.
Well, again, it's pretty clear that Mr. Luskin doesn't understand punctuated equilibrium because his analogy makes no sense. I don't know why he chose to describe a video recording on a VHS tape specifically either. That's just weird.
There have also been complaints from biologists who say that it's called punk-eek. The punk-eek model requires too much biological change too quickly. And you just can't get that kind of biological change too rapidly. In fact, I don't have the exact quote at my fingertips, but Darwin said in Origin of Species that in order to get the variation that is needed to build new species, you need very large population sizes, because that is where you can have enough opportunities for just by chance for you to you basically to produce these new forms these new advantageous forms that his theory requires. Okay, well, punk-eek basically robs Darwin's theory of the probabilistic resources that it needs. It says that the vast majority of the evolution takes place in the vast minority of organisms and in these very small periods of time. So you don't have the time that Darwin's theory needs, and you don't have the large population that Darwin's theory needs to generate this evolutionary novelty. So I think that punk-eek, it's really not a very good solution to the problem of why the fossil record lacks transitional forms. But that's probably the main argument you would get.
Well, speaking of weird, I will take Mr. Luskin at his word that someone refers to punctuated equilibrium as punk-eek. The main issue with this section that I haven't addressed yet is the equivocation of Darwin's original proposals regarding evolution and the state of current study in evolutionary biology. While the core principles of evolution proposed by Charles Darwin have not changed, the extended evolutionary synthesis in biology has shown evidence for different mechanisms, methods of study, and relevance to other subfields of biology Darwin was either unaware of or was wrong about in some of his predictions of the field. Calling modern evolutionary biology Darwinism is like calling M-theory of physics Einsteinism. Like, sure, the theory developed by that person is integral to how the current theories of the field function, but it's incredibly misleading.
Okay, so and just to be clear, like when we're talking about transitional forms, we're talking about forms between species, right?
Yes.
So I want to make that clear because, again, you'd be surprised how many things get lost in translation or whatever by the time that it gets down to like the comment section of this YouTube channel,
Gotcha.
where people will say, yeah, but I mean, like Darwin's finch beaks, for goodness sakes, or even like think about all the different dog breeds. Like breeders will select for certain traits and create dogs in a particular direction for particular reasons effectively and consistently. So are you going to disagree with that, Casey? And so how is what you're saying compatible with those obvious types of evolution, but at the same time, what are we seeing in the fossil? Like, what are we and what are we not seeing in the fossil record?
Great question.
Selective breeding in domestic dogs is a somewhat bad example of evolution in the context of the fossil record. Sure, selective breeding works on the exact same biological processes that natural selection does, but the fact that humans can and do breed dogs with the intent of developing or exaggerating selected characteristics gives the misleading impression that intent is an element of evolution when it's not. Skip this. The section I'm skipping here is an ad insert for the original video's sponsor. As always, the original video will be linked below if anyone wishes to check it.
Yep.
I think the first thing you're going to get in the comments is people are going to start saying, what about this transitional form? Or what about that transitional form? And look, there are a lot of fossils out there, but let's talk about a couple of the most popular examples that are given for supposed transitional forms. One of them is Archaeopteryx, okay? Archaeopteryx is said to be a transitional form that shows that birds evolved from dinosaurs?
Birds are dinosaurs. The amount of skeletal characteristics that modern birds share with the fossilized remains of ancient dinosaurs, and the fact that feathers, a very distinct sort of body structure, show up in dinosaur fossils demonstrates this.
Okay, the problem with Archaeopteryx is that it had true feathers and it probably flew. Okay, it had, people will say it was transitional because it had claws, a bony tail, and teeth. Now, there are some actually modern birds that have claws, so that really is not a very good example. But there are also many true birds from the fossil record that had teeth and a bony tail. So the idea that a bird could have claws, a teeth, and a bony tail is not at all unusual, okay? But what's interesting is that if Archaeopteryx is considered a true bird, the dinosaurs that are supposedly ancestral to Archaeopteryx, basically the dinosaurs from which birds supposedly evolved, they don't come in the fossil record until about 20 to 25 million years after Archaeopteryx already appears in the fossil record, okay? So you cannot be an ancestor of something that lived a long time before you, okay? So that means that these dinosaurs, they're called theropods, or various types of theropods, the theropod dinosaurs that are supposedly ancestral to birds and are supposed to be, transitional forms, et cetera, they really cannot be true direct transitional forms because they don't show up until many millions of years after we already see true birds in the fossil record.
This argument is pretty muddled in how it's presented. Archaeopteryx is generally not considered to be the ancestral species of all modern birds. Instead, it's considered a decent approximation of that creature. It sounds like Mr. Luskin is conflating the term bird, specifically referring to modern birds, with a technical term used to describe fossil animals who share all the defining characteristics with modern birds, which don't necessarily have the same common ancestor as modern birds.
Let me give you another example. This has to do with...
Can I just ask,
yeah, sure.
before you go to the... Can I just say really quick... We're talking about like the layers of the fossil record, right? And like you're basically saying that if it's true that this bird came as a byproduct or through evolution from the dinosaur, it should be above, right? In terms of like we're digging down, like it should be above the dinosaur, but instead you're saying it's below the dinosaur. I know you're talking about 25, but I'm thinking about just speaking to all sectors of my audience. Like that's the simplest way to put it, right?
I'm not going to blame the host for saying something misleading, but I am going to correct him. Sections of layers of sedimentary rock containing fossils don't always stay in the same relative position to other layers due to changes in the Earth's crust. One of the best examples of this is fossils of marine creatures found on Mount Everest, which was a key piece of evidence for the general acceptance of the theory of plate tectonics. The collision of the Indian subcontinent with southern Asia raised layers of rocks which were once the floor of a sea, upwards tens of thousands of feet, to become the modern Himalayas.
That's the simplest way to put it, yeah. Stratigraphically speaking is the way we would say it in geology. You should find the ancestor to be lower in the stratigraphy and the layers than the descendant. But instead, we find the reverse is often true.
Unless he names a particular instance of this happening, I don't believe him. I've never seen an ancestral species only appearing in newer layers than the descendant species. Now, something that could be described like what Mr. Luskin has said is the appearance of a new species while the previous species it branched off from still exists, because then you can have fossils of the ancestral form intermingled with those of the derived form. Taking a case like that out of context and presenting it as an ancestor appearing after the descendant of the fossil record would be abhorrently dishonest, however.
That means that this fossil that you're claiming is a transitional form cannot be ancestral to this thing that actually came many millions of years before it, okay? That's what we're saying.
Got it.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's like saying that you were your grandpa, you were your own grandpa or something like that. It just doesn't work.
Yeah. And then you were going on to an even more brilliant point. So sorry I interrupted you. I just wanted to make sure that there was no like linguistic red herring that took away from the main point there. So anyway,
sure. So another example that people will give is whales. According to the standard evolutionary theory model, what they will say is that first you had sea-dwelling organisms that walked on land. They evolved into amphibians and then reptiles. Some reptiles evolved into mammals, and then certain types of mammals actually evolved back into the sea, and those would be whales, okay, or other mammals as well, okay, that are aquatic. So according to standard evolutionary theory, whales are descended from land mammals, okay? And so some people will claim that there are actually fossils that document this evolutionary transition going from land mammals into fully aquatic whales. And there's only a few potential transitions there, but there are some. And, even if let's just grant, for the sake of argument, that they look like something that could be a land-based mammal, a terrestrial mammal that is evolving to have a more aquatic lifestyle and becoming more and more like a whale, okay? Let's just grant, for the sake of argument, that there are some fossils that look like that. I have some questions about these fossils, but let's grant that. I remember when I was in my undergrad, I took a course in geobiology that talked about how the evolution of whales was incredibly rapid. My professor actually talked about this. And what we see in the fossil record is that there's less than a 10 million year window to go from a fully terrestrial mammal to a fully aquatic whale. And in that time period, you have to evolve numerous complex adaptations that whales have that allow them to have that fully aquatic lifestyle. We're talking about evolving things like ball vertebrae, reducing the hind limbs, converting your forelimbs into flippers, having a reproductive system in males where you can have the testes inside the body, which requires this really complicated, like cooling antifreeze type system to keep the testes cool. A change in the musculature of the blowhole that allows, and the shape of the skull that allows them to breathe through a blowhole. All kinds of other biological and physiological changes, and numerous changes, basically. Okay, and the question is, could you do that in a mere 10 million years?
The sources I found on the evolution of cetaceans, the clade of animals that whales are a part of, indicate that their evolution from land-dwelling animals to their modern form took place over at least 15 million years. 10 million years versus 15 million years is a lot of difference, tens of thousands of generations of difference. Given this time disparity and the meticulous listing of particular adaptations, which I can only assume was supposed to generate the feeling of a massive barrier, I feel confident in concluding that Mr. Luskin is being hyperbolic about how quickly whales evolved.
Now, there was a study. That may seem like a long time, but whales actually are kind of, in some ways, they're like a worst case scenario for evolution. They have relatively small population sizes, they have relatively long generation times, and as a large mammal, they're going to have a relatively low mutation rate. So you're going to need to get many mutations, and you're going to have to do that where you don't have many rolls of the dice, so to speak, because again, small population size, long generation time, low mutation rate, which mammals tend to have. Okay.
This argument only works if we assume that the ancestors of whales also had small populations with long lifespans. As for a low rate of mutations, this is another case where punctuated equilibrium could partially explain the process, but we don't even need to assume that because a typical characteristic of a kind of animal is not absolute. We would have to rule out a higher susceptibility to mutation before we can make any assumptions based on that idea.
Okay, and so the problem really gets acute when we talk about the need for what we call coordinated mutations. This kind of goes back to where we were talking about proteins earlier, where you would need many amino acids to be in just the right order before you get any, stable functional protein fold to give you a functional protein. You would need a lot of information to be there. Basically, lots of information, lots of mutations have to be there. In order, when I say mutations, I just mean, amino acids or nucleotides in the right place in order to get that information that's needed to get it to work right, okay? The same thing would be true for these complex adaptations that whales have.
Well, finally, something that vaguely involves mathematics has come up. To start, Mr. Luskin asserts that evolutionary adaptations of whale ancestors to reach their modern form were the coordinated mutations he mentioned, but there's no source sharing evidence of that with the video. If he mentions one that investigates this claim before the end, fair enough, but without any evidence of this hypothesis, I can't really do much. Now, coordinated mutations, from what research tells me, are a set of mutations in a creature's genetic material which impose a hindrance to the creature's capability to pass on its genes to further generations unless they all occur simultaneously within an individual. Given that it is known most mutations are neutral to survivability, this situation seems somewhat unlikely to me. There's also phenomena like suppressor mutations, which allow a creature to live with what would be a negative mutation without experiencing its effects. If the offspring of such a creature were to inherit this silenced negative mutation from the parent, then at some point in a future generation more suppressed mutations could build up in the population's genetic material. From there, if a set of the suppressor mutations were lost in a particular individual, that creature could experience a coordinated mutation that delivers a positive effect to its reproductive capability. And we've again encountered the term information relating to mutations this time. The way Mr. Luskin uses the word seems to indicate that he means a particular genetic sequence that expresses an adaptation. I'm kind of puzzled by this apparent focus on a particular sequence because the genetic code contains a lot of synonymous subsequences. The way genes are read by an organism's cells makes it so that different packets of nucleotides, the chemicals that directly store the patterns of genetic material, cause the building of a singular amino acid, the chemicals that are used in creature to perform most biological functions. These packets are called codons, and the fact that one amino acid corresponds to multiple of them is the reason why a lot of mutations make no difference in function, making them neutral. On top of the genetic code having this feature of redundant codons, some proteins can have multiple types of amino acids swapped out in their structure without it changing their ability to function. These mutations are also neutral towards the creature's reproductive capability. Overall, then, short of some research that shows coordinated mutations happening out in the wild, I'm not buying that they're a significant burden to the process of evolution.
Okay, and so there was a study that was published in the journal Genetics a number of years ago. Actually, this paper was published by some Cornell mathematicians who are population geneticists trying to refute Michael Behe, the per-ID biochemist we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, okay? And what they found is that if you have a population that has a relatively long generation time, low population size, that to get a trait that just requires 2 mutations before it gives you some advantage towards surviving reproduction, that could take over 200 million years just to get those 2 mutations showing up in one organism at the same time, in the same place at the same time. To get that trait that requires just 2 mutations before you get a selective advantage. What this means is that whale evolution is facing a serious mathematical problem, okay?
As I mentioned before, no sources are linked for this video, and the study being referred to wasn't named, so how am I supposed to check if what's being said is true? I'm rather skeptical of this claim.
If you need multiple mutations to be present before you get biological functionality in these complex adaptations, there's no way you're going to be able to evolve those traits in 10 million years, or maybe even less, depending upon how you interpret the whale cetacean fossil record.
Again, the sources I've found indicate that cetaceans evolved over a period of at least 15 million years.
Okay, so yes, even if we see these transitional forms, what we see with whale evolution, I believe, is actually a mathematical refutation of the possibility that standard blind evolutionary mechanisms caused that transition to happen. Okay? That means that basically it wasn't neo-Darwinism. It was.
I would be far more inclined to consider this supposed refutation based on mutation rate if Mr. Luskin would bother sharing a single one of his sources for me to look over myself. Also, this argument wouldn't be a mathematical refutation, it'd be a biological one. I guess I got clickbaited again.
We don't have an evolutionary model to explain how whales evolved so quickly. And to me, the need for all that information to show up so rapidly implicates intelligent design was involved in the process. And by the way, intelligent design is not necessarily incompatible with common ancestry.
Really? I would think that the insertion of particular sequences of genetic material into the cells of a creature by some intelligent force would throw out the concept of common ancestry altogether. In microorganisms like viruses and bacteria, the genetic material is very small in size, so any intentional edits to their RNA would make a major difference. Even in creatures large enough for people to see, the sudden appearance of changes to genetic material that couldn't be explained by inheritance and known mutation mechanisms would badly undermine the concept of descent with modification. An intelligent designer is just too much of a square peg for the round hole of evolution evidence from biology.
I mean, I personally am a skeptic of common ancestry, but you could have common ancestry, organisms sharing common ancestors through intelligent design. That is one way to look at it. And so maybe that's what happened with whales. I don't know. But I do know this, that blind, unguided, standard evolutionary mechanisms cannot explain the rapidity with which whales appear in the fossil record from their supposed terrestrial land mammal ancestors. So you can cite those transitional forms all you want, but standard evolution is not going to explain it.
So, just another reiteration of the argument. It's fine to be skeptical of anything, but personal skepticism isn't a license to replace widely known and accepted theories of science with an explanation that requires supernatural intervention. Let's recap all the problems with this video. We didn't get a definition for the term information in the context of biology. We didn't get a definition of the phrase clear direct evolutionary precursors. There was repeated usage of unsubstantiated innuendo to imply that evolutionary processes happen faster than can be explained. No explanation was given on how the designer in intelligent design works. Dishonest presentation of what a transitional fossil is, a wrong explanation on how punctuated equilibrium works, conflation of the state of biology 150 years ago with its state now, false equivocation of a common term with a technical term to try and claim that birds aren't dinosaurs, a flat-out lie that the fossils of any ancestral species have been found only in layers newer than the fossils of a descendant, misquoting the current consensus amount of time that whales took to evolve, a claim that the ancestors of whales must have had the same population and lifespan as current whales, several repeated unsubstantiated claims about the existence and necessity of coordinating mutations, and I got clickbaited. Oh, and no sources either named or linked. Well, unlike Mr. Luskin, I will be linking sources for my claims and definitions below. Thanks for watching.